Thank you all for having me. Today I'll be talking about my work entitled Aliens of Our World.
Can you speak into the microphone?
Yeah. Can you hear me a little bit better now?
Yes.
Better? Okay. So today I'll be talking about Aliens of Our World, 19th-century naturalists in H.G. Wells's The Time Machine and John Clare's bird poems. So today I'll be making an unlikely comparison between these two 19th century writers. You can see Clare and Wells hidden out in the corner here, getting overtaken by Morlocks and glowworms. The glowworm will make an appearance in the next slide as well. But they're often not spoken of in tandem. Since John Clare was working in the earlier part of the century and during the Romantic era with contemporaries like Byron and Keats and Shelley, and he was a sensitive, laboring poet. He worked in the countryside. So he was off gallivanting in the countryside and writing about the birds and the bees, literal birds and bees, not the other thing. But H.G. Wells was writing at the turn of the century, the fin-de-siècle, and he was undertaking epic projects and rescaling the cosmos in his writing. So you're probably wondering, what do these two have in common? So I remember the first, second, third time I was reading over their work, and Wells was obviously a favorite, but John Clare has a surprising science fictionality to his writing, to his poetry. Now, while Wells was pioneering the science fiction genre, Clare, I argue, was also pioneering it in his own way, but writing about creatures on Earth rather than on extraterrestrial environments. And I emphasize this because, to me, science fiction is more than simply a genre. It's a mode, it's a mood, it's a feeling. It almost is a subjunctive mode of possibility, characterized by wonder and awe and estrangement. As Joanna Russ writes, it's worshipful in tone and even transcendental. So today I wanted to show you how Wells and Clare both meet at this science-fictional nexus. And there are 2 points of intersection. First, this mode of estrangement that they utilize. They grapple with creatures that exist on the threshold of the unknown and the knowable. And 2, they do this by inventing characters who are naturalists. So I'll be comparing Wells's famous character, the time traveler, to Clare's poetic speakers, who are modeled after Clare himself. And in regards to estrangement, which is viewing familiar things with renewed interest, both Victorian scientists and authors were doing this at the time, and this allowed for societal and technological expansion. But while Clare was utilizing estrangement to explore the microscopic, the imperceptible, things that were hidden in plain sight, Wells was doing the complete opposite, right? He was conceptualizing the macroscopic, the grand schemes of society, globalization, and population issues. These macroscopic patterns are just as difficult to conceive of as the imperceptible. Again, Wells, as Sarah Cole says, was a world writer. They were simply working on different scales. So I'll open up with a pivotal quote by William Hazlitt, who was a 19th century English critic, painter, philosopher. He was a polymath in general. And he wrote a ton of essays that revered poetry. But in particular, there was one particular treatise that stood out to me. And he writes about the insect called the glowworm. Many romantics, for some reason, loved writing about this insect, the glowworm. Wordsworth, Charlotte Smith, Coleridge, they wrote about its radiance and likened its light to the meteors in the night sky. This visual here depicts a glowworm's habitat. It's very alien looking, right? They exist as these beads of larvae that hang from the ceilings of caves, and they create these magical, ethereal, bioluminescent structures that appear very, very interesting. You usually are very lucky to stumble upon one of these. And Hazlitt addresses these bioluminescent structures in his quote. He says, "Let the naturalist, if he will, catch the glowworm, carry it home with him in a box, and find it the next morning nothing but a little gray. Let the poet or the lover of poetry visit it at evening, when beneath the scented hawthorn and the crescent moon, it has built itself a palace of emerald green light." In other words, it's the unobtrusive poet, the gentle poet, that gets access to these hidden truths of the natural world, the aliens of our world, as I put it in my title. The artist and the writer, they observe things in their natural state, and this actively resists what empiricism was trying to do at the time, which was to pluck things out of their natural context. And this is a really epistemically interesting question to me. Who conveys truths better? The artist or the scientist? Fact or fiction? So I'll be exploring this predicament today. So John Clare, who was not a professionally schooled naturalist, slips right into the role of Hazlitt's poet. Now, unlike Victorian scientists of the time who were combing seashores for specimens to take back home, Clare approaches the world with an animated, poetic sensibility. He watches but rarely interrupts, and observes without ever needing to impose. Just like Hazlitt's poet, whose non-intrusiveness leads to glowing rewards, Clare gains access to the hidden world of birds. Clare's poetry features a decentering of the human self, but on the other hand, the time traveler, he has to be at the center of everything. He opens the novel by delivering a lecture on the fourth dimension and captures the attention of all these men who crowd around his prototype and his scrying table. The traveler is also a polymath like Hazlitt, but he's an inventor and he's a physicist. He's a philosopher of time, right? He was accessing Kant's theory of time from the Critique of Pure Reason. But he was also chasing out Newtonian mechanics for Einstein's relativity theory. But also, I argue, his quest into the future also places him in the role of naturalist, and this is often not talked about enough. He's a disruptive naturalist, but a naturalist nonetheless. The time traveler is the type to pluck the glowworm off a leaf and trap it in a box, too self-involved to notice it curling up into a motionless husk. He meddles with his alien specimens, the Eloi, the Morlocks, and other creatures of the far future, by imposing inhuman expectations onto them, and this is his first mistake. He begins to postulate that they must be degenerative descendants of man, hierarchizing them on an anthropocentric basis, viewing them as inferior to him rather than as separate species worthy of wonder. Clare, on the other hand, approaches birds with a sense of novelty. He frees birds from the cage of symbolic, referential, and fabulistic meanings. Ultimately, Clare's approach anticipates more modern forms of eco-critical thinking. His work is ahead of its time, science-fictional even. But modern eco-critical studies have sought to move away from the anthropocentric model featured in the time traveler's approach. Despite being a time traveler, he was very much a product of his time. The Victorian quest for the other. The only similarity that these two share is that they are both men who engage in the classic Victorian search for the other. They're both fascinated by the unknowable, the alien, and the inaccessible creatures of the natural world, whether it be in the present, for Clare, or the future, for the time traveler. They engage readers in an act of reviewing and are themselves challenged epistemically by the creatures that they notice. As George Levine puts it, the world looks to be one thing. Astonishingly, it is really another. So the Earth takes on an unfamiliar quality in the eyes of Clare and the time traveler, due to their choice to reorient themselves. The time traveler reorients himself temporally, while Clare reorients himself spatially within the woods. He finds himself at home in wasteland spaces and mystical marshes. He transforms into something non-human, even, to tread these human-resistant environments. The Romantic era's surging love for natural history flowed fiercely into the Victorian period. Explorers, naturalists, geologists, and botanists were propelled by an overwhelming drive to collect, witness, and catalog nature. The role of naturalist experienced its peak in the 19th century and has diminished greatly ever since. Natural history eventually transformed into the wide-ranging field of biology that we have now. It experienced an intellectual split that separated natural history's descriptive mode from science's lean towards the hypothetico-deductive method. The latter achieved dominant market share in the university because that was where science apparently belonged, in the world of hypothesis testing and experimentation. Nature, on the other hand, as some critics have asserted, has always begged to be described, illustrated, appreciated, and conserved, not tested. So naturalism and science split as fields, the former tending towards fieldwork, mobility, description, and the latter towards testing. One was full of motion, and the other was motionless. Both Clare and the time traveler, though quite different, both participate in this animated mode of poetic naturalism that moves away from the lab in favor of nature writing, specifically literary nature writing. The literariness of naturalism. Now, Victorian natural history was surprisingly tied up in literature. It engaged in persuasive writing that reinforced bridges between science and art, between empiricism and poetry. We can see this in the eloquent writing of Huxley and Darwin, Tyndall and Lyell, who sought to better man's estate by combining the power of literature with the clarifying lens of science. I've put up some of their portraits here. We've got John Tyndall, the physicist, T.H. Huxley, of course, the evolutionary biologist and mentor to H.G. Wells, Charles Darwin, and of course my favorite, James C. Maxwell, the physicist and poet. Now, in his famous Belfast Address, Irish physicist John Tyndall praises scientific writing for playing an essential role in the naturalists' enterprise to change the way we see and the way we feel about the world. Clare unknowingly led this enterprise despite being an early 19th century poet. He had no problem fusing scientific sense with poetic sensibility. I think of the perceptive microscopic details in his poetry, such as when he captures the fern owl whizzing as quick as a thought. Wells's character instead relies on oral storytelling and transcription. He sits amongst journalists, doctors, and psychologists and engages in loud discussions about his adventures. The futuristic man slides into a devolutionary state, as he seems to prefer pre-literate forms of communication over others. And this is a novel about the future. He also enjoys being written about as much as he enjoys storytelling. He himself becomes literary material, a journalistic specimen. Fact or fiction? This is a still from the 1960s adaptation of The Time Machine. Though he's not a writer, the time traveler is a composer of stories in his own right. Story takes on manifold meanings here. The traveler's accounts become a piece of reportage, a sensational story, a relaying of fact, but it also takes on the potential to be a work of art or a fictional story. Instead of striving for accuracy, the time traveler seems perfectly content with the idea that his lived experience can be reduced to effective fiction. In chapter 16, he coolly scans the room of friendly faces and he utters, "Take it as a lie or a prophecy. Treat my assertion of truth as a mere stroke of art to enhance its interest." And taking it as a story, he says, "What do you think?" His tale-telling seems to exist in symbiosis with fact. His stories derive their very narrative texture from real-life events. The traveler then falls silent, rubs the withered white flowers, a poorly preserved specimen of future Earth, and gazes at the half-healed scars on its knuckles. The flower will eventually decay, and the scars will soon heal. If you think about it, preserving life as evidence for any time traveler is a paradox. Time travelers are destined to be poor naturalists. There's no adequate method to transport life from the future to the past as a form of proof. Life is in a constant state of motion, of process, and transformation and decay. Naturalistic study is only compatible with the present. Time travel therefore complicates the naturalist project. And as a result, the time traveler must dull the acuity of his impressions and mold them into narrative form. If his adventures cannot be taken as fact, let them at least tell the truth through fiction. Now we'll talk a little bit about Clare's avian aliens. This is the snipe bird who lives in the wetlands. So the grand paradox of the Victorian Naturalist Project is that in its attempt to affirm the possibilities of empiricism, it simultaneously affirmed the limits of science. The project had epic ambitions to showcase the Earth as this brave new world of incomprehensible wonder, to jolt people out of normal ways of seeing. So they called for a more powerful, penetrative scientific imagination that had the ability to peer beyond the externally visible world, beyond the externally visible world, but this backfired since it highlighted the limits of scientific explanation. Instead of feeling defeated, Victorian scientists embraced this antinomy. They declared that the natural world could be simultaneously knowable and unknowable, empirically determinable, but also metaphysically confusing. In essence, naturalism was an art as much as a science. It became literary. Now, Clare's approach towards the other embraces this paradox. He did not know this at the time, though. His poetic methods are defined by a wondrous estrangement for the creatures and flora he adores. Wonder represents for Clare a compromise between knowing and total separation. On his daily wanderings, Clare would often imagine the birds he encountered to be the inhabitants of new countries. I'll briefly focus on one of his poems today, dedicated to the snipe bird, which we see here. In it, Clare thrusts readers into the peatland ecosystem of the bird. Clare infuses a wondrous alien novelty to the bill. For here thy bill, suited by wisdom good, of rude unseemly length, doth delve and drill the gelid mass for food. The bill's utility and design surpass any human tool, and though Clare is limited to anthropocentric analogies, his analogies, unlike the time travelers, are self-conscious. They're aware of their underwhelming ability to convey something that surpasses human description. No drill can emulate the peculiar eating pattern of the snipe. The bill is lined with a delicate bundle of nerves. This allows the snipe to sense larvae in the mud without ever seeing it. In other words, the snipe possesses a sixth sense. Clare lives up to Hazlitt's poet here. He doesn't care to capture the bird, and he recognizes that its exquisite alien-like qualities can only be seen in the gentle process of visitation. Lastly, we'll talk about the art of capturing specimens. Don't be scared of the Morlocks. They're trying to take over. Capturing is inherently tied up in motion. There's the scientific sense of the word, which is to entrap and to subordinate someone. There's the literary sense, which is to render and depict something faithfully. And then there's also the photographic sense. Hazlitt alludes to the first two senses of capture, in which the poet is described as visiting, while the naturalist catches. One is gentle, and the other is quite violent. Clare always visits with a fluid and cautionary restraint, but restraint is not the word I would use to describe the time traveler. He moves forcefully against the current and disrupts the natural world by capturing specimens and declaring them to be his possessions, and then he discards them when he no longer finds them useful. When he attempts to secure the kangaroo rat man of the far future, it becomes obvious that the time traveler is not able to contemplate things with fluid, symbiotic continuity like Clare. Instead, he must kill motion in order to study it, just as a naturalist kills and pins up a butterfly in order to study life. The motionless gray animal only appears dead, however, and this is a very important fact. It's on its last legs. The time traveler's examination of a motionless being on the brink of death is entirely deliberate. It not only allows him to play the role of naturalist, but it also offers him an opportunity to examine creatures while they're still technically alive. He's cheating the naturalist methodology. It's safe to assume that he may never revisit the future with the wondrous repeated dedication of Clare, as his imperialistic desire to claim the initial discovery and the first vision is his main priority. I have a quick recap here because that was a lot of information. So we've got the poetic naturalist, the hands-off naturalist like Clare, versus the invasive naturalist, the hands-on one, the time traveler who interferes with the environment. He instills suicidal fear in the Morlocks and attempts to teach the Eloi a new language that they do not want to learn. Then we've got the Victorian quest for the other. And this was a very important enterprise during the Victorian era, and Wells and Clare are both situated in this enterprise. And I think that's what makes them so worthy of study. They also look at otherworldly operations of birds, and the time traveler encounters the other, but he seems to be bored by them rather than entertained by them. Number 3, literary nature of scientific writing. As we talked about before, people like Tyndall and Lyell and Darwin were engaging in the power of metaphor and the power of literary writing to basically capture things that were epistemically confusing or very difficult to explain with scientific language. And of course, fact versus fiction. The time traveler shows how truth and fact can actually sometimes be better conveyed through fiction. And he doesn't get defensive about the fact that people don't believe his story, which is admirable, because I would be defensive. Then we've also got the power of wonder. Now, wonder is obviously a science-fictional mood, as Joanna Russ says, but Clare also utilizes wonder very much so in his writing, in his poetry, and I think that's what really makes his work science-fictional. Capturing specimens. Now, while Clare captures birds literarily, the time traveler does so with violence. And in the end, Clare memorializes his subjects, and the time traveler ultimately destroys them. Thank you.